Hello there, this is Warpath 985 speaking, and in day 9 to 12 Days of War, I shall be discussing the Transformers Legacy Velocitron Speedia 500 Holler. Now, Holler is a pretty interesting character because although yes, he did appear in the G1 cartoon, he was technically supposed to be a different character, and that is, well, Grapple. And the reason why I really say that, as mentioned beforehand in the previous view, Grapple and Holler apparently is supposed to be the same character in the G1 cartoon, or more or less what originally Holler was supposed to be Grapple. Because, really, Holler was originally supposed to be in the first 1984 wave of figures. However, he was swapped out with an extra Mirage in most of the packs and was generally moved to next year. However, this was before really the general finalization and etc. of the G1 cartoon. So by then, Holler was already written into the G1 cartoon, and thusly that's how we got, well, Holler. Even though yes, in the cartoon he was, well, orange like Grapple, in future continuities he was reckoned to be the long lost Constructicon, technically 7th member, but really at the time it was technically the 8th member, because Gravedigger also existed beforehand to fill in that weird like gap with these weird 8 member Constructicon looking guys seen in the, I want to say the War Dome, but at least it was the 5 Faces of Darkness arc, the first arc of season 3. That was Holler for a while. He was just the e-hobby character size figure until he got more characterization and further on, until we finally got, well, Velocitron Speedia 500 Holler, which is our first ever Holler in both a retail form but also a version that is, once again, still rarely available and is actually uniquely enough slightly different, because oddly enough, Holler, in comparison to Grapple, does actually have a unique sculpt / exclusive part, that being his head, which we start with the view. Now we start with the figure, because the figure of Holler is essentially the same exact figure as, well, Grapple, obviously with the new tooling derived from Kingdom Inferno to fix the tab / port problem that was mentioned in the Grapple review. However, with Holler, they also included an entirely new part that was, once again, exclusive to Holler, that being his head sculpt, which you can see right here is him yelling. A unique part with it is that, as you can also see, because Holler, by extension, the Grapple mold in general, the Mitsubishi mold, etc., has a mushroom peg as a ball joint for the head, and because of that he has a green tongue. It's hard to see in certain angles, but it shines light through here. I'll use my phone light for this because I can't put my flashlight. It's right there. The mushroom peg appears as like a tongue. So he's one of the handful of figures that in recent time actually has a tongue, which is in robot mode, which is kind of funny. But yeah. Now I'll be skipping over transformation and most other things here and there because I covered essentially all that in the Grapple review. But however, we'll be talking about the general wider aspect of the figure, that being his general colorization and him being, well, Constructicon. And for the reason why I have these figures in these general configuration is mainly just because Grapple in the cartoon had this little nozzle here, and I realized that that kind of really conflicts mostly if I had two figures basically with a nozzle, so I decided just to give Holler the claw instead, trying to differentiate the two. Even though yes, Holler was mainly seen to use a hook instead of a claw. However, with Grapple, he was shown to use a claw instead of a hook most of the time. So yeah, it doesn't really make sense, though in robot mode it doesn't really matter to me. It's just I want to differentiate much further besides, well, their color scheme. But for articulation, relatively speaking, the figure is pretty much exactly the same. as Grapple. However, once again, I would mainly be skipping over that because, again, I discussed this mold beforehand, and thusly, I didn't really discuss anything else. The only thing I really will be saying that is a difference besides Grapple is mainly due to the yellowing. As unlike Grapple, a lot of Legacy figures have this problem where they yellowed, and this wasn't really revealed until someone very recently, or at least was basically just confirming certain data information that a lot of toy collectors already knew but are now seeing through, and it makes a lot of sense now. So essentially, Hasbro kind of sort of messed up the chemical process with the flame retardant bonding / chemical that mixed in with plastics to ensure they don't burn. However, due to this new change, in either to save costs or in general to improve it, they indirectly caused the same problem as happened with a lot of figures from the 80s with flame retardant plastics, such as being figures with a white plastic being primarily affected. However, those weren't the only figures that had that. All figures, like for example from G.I. Joe, were affected by that. We're seeing a pretty much not a renaissance, but just a re-emergence of this problem with newer figures, and unfortunately Holler is no exception. As you can see here, his arms and all the polymer plastics across the whole body are yellowing to this weird pea color instead of like the more limeish green. And that only really affects really all copies of Holler. Doesn't really affect, from my knowledge, other Velocitron figures besides Holler. Because I do own pretty much all the Velocitron figures except for like a slight exception for a few. That being obviously G1 Howard, who is pretty much unreleased / cancelled, and the original Lisa Galaxy Shuttle, for which I don't own any of those figures. However, I own all the other figures, and so far it's looking at Holler. So far it's looking at Holler. So far it's looking like Holler is the only figure that's affected by this, and not so much other figures from that general line. So, besides that, for general comparisons beyond just Grapple, here is Holler with the rest of the Constructicons, because, well, he's a Constructicon. Unfortunately, I was able to decombine and, separate all the Constructicons into their robot forms. Now, as you can see, unlike the various artwork usually depicts, the character model of Holler, the Combiner Wars / Unite Warriors mold is, for all the Constructicons, are slightly much larger, ranging around approximately either 7 inches, I believe, 7 to almost 8 to 9 inches in height, but primarily most of them are in that 7-inch range, as they're above 5 and 6 inch approximately for most of the figures, especially in the case of long haul. And due to the reason it is kind of hard to fit all of them into frame. But yeah, here are all the Constructicons and the Holler together, which is kind of hard because all of them are really big, which is pretty cool that now I have all essentially the figures of them available of Constructicons current right now. And besides the comparisons, let's move on to vehicle mode. But yeah, here's Holler in his vehicle mode, and as you can see, he's essentially just Grapple. Now, yes, that is pretty much it for this review. Beyond that, because again, I already discussed this mold, and I really need to just generally talk about it further. Mainly just because, again, I discussed this in my Grapple review, and for the reason, I didn't really need to talk about how this figure any further beyond that. So, if you're interested about more general information about the figure and the vehicle mode and further experiences with other Mitsubishi figures that are derived from this mold, from Grapple, please check out my Grapple review. But for Holler, I must say, it is pretty accurate to the E-Holly figure colorization and general just look. However, I must note that it is kind of interesting overall that, once again, unfortunately, you can see the yellow is much more apparent in vehicle mode than it is in robot mode. However, uniquely enough, and instead of silver, he actually is colored in gunmetal gray for all these little parts here and here, and also here as well with the nozzle, which is pretty cool, I must say. But it is also kind of a little strange, I guess, because I believe originally I think it was silver. However, not really that much of a we care about it in general, because again, it does technically work a lot better with the Constructicons, who are universally gunmetal gray instead of like the silver. So it makes more sense for him to be like gunmetal gray instead of silver, but whatever. It is like a unique change in comparison to like Grapple and other uses of this mold beforehand. But yeah, that's all for day 9 of 12 Days of War. Like, comment, subscribe, and hopefully I shall see you for day 10. Bye.